Rome is usually described as something that ended, a fallen empire, a name left behind in textbooks on ruins, on cracked stones that tourists photograph in afternoon light. But the strange thing about great civilizations is that they rarely vanish the way people imagine. They do not always burn out in one clean moment. Sometimes they thin out, sometimes they stretch so wide they become invisible. Sometimes they change shape so slowly that the ending only becomes visible much later, when the world around them has already learned to speak their language without remembering where it came from. That is where this story begins. Not with collapse, but with continuation. Long before anyone tried to define the fall of Rome, Rome was already everywhere. In roads that cut across hills and valleys with impossible confidence. In laws that told people how to live, trade, inherit, and obey. In words that crossed generations and survived the empires that used them. In cities built to endure beyond the men who ordered their construction. In institutions that outlasted the people who first imagined them. Rome was never just one thing. It was a shape made from many parts, and shapes have a habit of surviving even when the names attached to them disappear. The usual story says the empire fell. That word, fall, is heavy with finality. It suggests a body hitting the ground, a door shutting, a flame going out. But history is rarely that obedient. History likes loose ends. It leaves behind traces. It keeps moving under the surface even when the surface looks perfectly calm. A road still used. A law still quoted. A word still spoken. A border moved, yet the logic behind it still intact. A ritual repeated by people who no longer know its first name. These are the details that make the past feel less like a museum and more like a living thing, moving just below the surface of everything familiar. And this is where the first quiet mystery appears. If Rome truly ended, why did so much of it remain? The answer is not simple, because the question itself is misleading. It assumes that a civilization can be treated like a candle, lit one day and extinguished the next. But empires are not candles, they are systems. And systems do not usually vanish without a trace. They transform, they fragment, they pass their weight into other hands, other institutions, other languages. The emperor may be gone, but the road still stretches toward the horizon. The capital may weaken, but the tongue continues. The throne may empty, but the habits of power quietly remain. That is why the fall of Rome is less like a single event and more like a long shadow, crossing centuries without ever fully lifting. When people are taught the fall of Rome, they are usually given a date, 476 AD, a year that sounds like a door slamming shut. A German chieftain named Odoacer deposes the last Western emperor, a young boy named Romulus Augustulus, and with that single act, the story is over. An empire that once stretched from Britain to the edges of Mesopotamia, from the cold forests of the Rhine to the burning sands of North Africa, is reduced to one sentence, one date, one ending. But history is almost never that neat. The truth, when examined closely, is far more layered. The Western Roman Empire did not collapse overnight. It dissolved over decades, sometimes centuries, through a process that no one living through it would have recognized as an ending at all. Trade slowed in some regions while thriving in others. Populations shifted. Local leaders took on administrative roles once reserved for imperial officials. Laws continued to be applied. Roads continued to be used. Cities continued to function. The people living inside the empire did not wake up one morning and discover that Rome was gone. They simply woke up to a world that looked a little different from the one before it, and then a little more different again and again. Until one day, historians looking backward decided to call it something new. That is the first shortcut history takes with Rome. It collapses a long, complicated transformation into one clean moment of ending. And once that shortcut becomes the standard version, it shapes everything that comes after. People stop asking what continued, they only ask what fell. Yet the moment that question is reversed, the moment someone asks not what ended but what survived, the entire picture changes. The roads were still there. The legal principles were still being applied in courts across the former empire. Latin was still being spoken, still being written, still being used to conduct church services, draft contracts, and record the laws of kingdoms that claimed to have replaced Rome while quietly inheriting its most useful habits. The administrative divisions of the old empire became the ecclesiastical divisions of the new church. The trade routes that Roman merchants had used became the routes of medieval commerce. The cities that Rome had built did not vanish. They simply changed their rulers, their religions, and sometimes their names, while keeping their foundations, their streets, and their basic logic of organization intact. This is not what collapse looks like. This is what transformation looks like when it moves slowly enough to be mistaken for an ending. The scholars who later labelled 476 AD as the fall of the Western Roman Empire were not wrong about the political fact. A particular kind of central authority did end. But the label they attached to that fact carried more weight than the fact itself deserved. It suggested a total disappearance, a complete erasure. And that suggestion quietly shaped the way later generations thought about the past, about civilization, about how things end and what comes after. It made Rome into a cautionary tale about the limits of power rather than a case study in the persistence of structure. But the structures persisted regardless of the label. And they kept persisting long after the label became the standard version of events. There is a thought that keeps returning when the full history of Rome is examined without the standard labels. It is not a comfortable thought. It does not fit neatly inside the usual timelines. But it refuses to go away. What if Rome never truly ended? What if it only changed its name? Not in any mystical sense. Not as a romantic idea about eternal empires. But in the most practical, observable, physical sense possible. Roads still carrying movement. Laws still governing behaviour. Languages still transmitting thought. Cities still organising life along the same basic patterns. Institutions still operating on principles that had been written down in Latin centuries before the people using them were born. If those things continued, then what exactly collapsed? The answer that emerges slowly, the one that this entire story is built around, is that what collapsed was a particular political arrangement, a central authority, a recognizable throne, a unified command structure. Those things ended in the West in the 5th century, and their ending was real and significant. But beneath those visible structures, the deeper architecture of Roman civilization kept doing what it had always done. It organized movement. It governed behavior. It shaped language and thought. It provided the hidden skeleton on which later centuries built their own, very different-looking worlds. That hidden skeleton is what this story is really about. Because when the question shifts from politics to physics, something unexpected happens. The idea of a civilization that transforms rather than disappears begins to sound less like romantic historical revisionism and more like a description of how systems actually behave. Energy does not vanish, it changes form. Matter does not disappear, it rearranges itself. Systems under pressure do not always collapse into nothing. They redistribute, reorganize, and continue under new conditions. If those principles describe the physical world with reliable accuracy, then it is worth asking whether they might also describe the human world with more accuracy than the simple story of collapse allows. That question is what waits in the chapters ahead. There is a rule at the heart of the physical world that does not bend for anyone. It does not make exceptions for stars or stones or living things. It does not pause for human events or recognize the difference between a great civilization and a single falling leaf. It simply holds, always and everywhere, without negotiation. That rule is the conservation of energy. And what it says is this: energy cannot be created from nothing, and it cannot be destroyed into nothing. It can only change form. A fire does not consume wood into non-existence. It transforms wood into heat, light, ash, and gas. The wood is gone in one sense, and yet in another sense everything that was in the wood is still there, redistributed into the world in different shapes. The flame that burns a letter does not erase the paper. It releases it. Every atom that made the page still exists somewhere, carried into the air, absorbed into the soil, absorbed into other things. The information on the page may be gone from human access, but the material of the page is not gone from the universe. This is not a poetic idea. It is a physical law. It is tested, confirmed, and relied upon in every branch of science that touches the real world. And it points to something uncomfortable and fascinating at the same time. The universe does not waste anything. Nothing truly disappears. Things only become harder to recognize. Now consider an empire, not as a political concept, but as a physical system. An empire is made of material things: roads of crushed stone and volcanic cement, buildings of cut granite and fired brick, documents written on treated animal skin, coins of silver and copper and gold. bodies of soldiers and merchants and administrators and farmers. All of that physical material is subject to the same laws that govern everything else in the universe. None of it can vanish. All of it can only change form. The road does not disappear when the empire that built it loses power. The stone is still there. The straightness is still there. The root is still there. It may be overgrown, cracked, repaired by someone else's hands, but it persists. The law of conservation does not care who built it. It only cares that the material exists, and material always exists somewhere. And beneath the material, there are the patterns, the habits, the knowledge of how to build, govern, tax, organize, and control. These are not physical in the way a stone is physical, but they are encoded in physical things, in documents, in minds, in trained behaviors, in architectural decisions, in the layout of cities, in the design of legal codes. These patterns survive by attaching themselves to material carriers. And as long as those carriers survive, the patterns survive with them. This is what the physics of persistence means when applied to civilization. Not that empires are immortal, not that power endures forever, but that the physical and cultural material from which empires are made does not vanish cleanly. It redistributes, it rearranges. It embeds itself in what comes next. There is another law that works alongside conservation, and it tells a slightly different part of the story. It is called entropy, and in its simplest form, it describes the tendency of systems to spread out over time, to move from concentrated, ordered states toward more diffuse, distributed ones. Heat flows from warm places to cool ones. Perfume released in one corner of a room eventually fills the entire space. A drop of ink in a glass of water does not stay a drop. It spreads until the water is uniformly coloured, and the original concentration is no longer visible. This might sound like a description of decay, and in some ways it is. But entropy is not the same as disappearance. The ink does not vanish from the water. It simply spreads until it is everywhere at once. The heat does not leave the room. It distributes itself until the room reaches a uniform temperature. The system does not cease to exist. It reorganizes into a more distributed form. Now consider what happened to Rome in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries in the West. Power became more distributed. The central authority in Ravenna and then Rome itself weakened, and authority migrated outward, into regional leaders, into church structures, into local strongmen and military commanders who had once served under imperial command. The concentrated centre of Roman power did not disappear. It spread. It moved from one visible location into dozens of smaller, less visible locations across a vast geographic space. The empire, in other words, underwent something that looks remarkably like entropy. But here is what entropy does not mean. It does not mean the end of function. The roads did not stop being roads when the central authority weakened. The laws did not stop being laws when the emperor who codified them was gone. The cities did not stop being cities when the administrative machinery that built them was no longer functioning at full capacity. The distributed system kept operating even as the central node weakened and eventually fell silent. This is what a dispersed empire looks like. It looks like decline from the center's perspective. But from the perspective of the roads, the laws, the cities, and the people using them, it looks something more like continuity under new management. That distinction is critical, because the story of Rome's fall is almost always told from the center's perspective. From the view of the throne, the Senate, the imperial administration, the formal apparatus of central power. From that view, the story ends in 476 AD, or whenever the particular political marker chosen by a given historian runs out. But from the perspective of the distributed system, from the view of the roads and laws and languages and cities, the story does not end at all. It simply enters a new phase, one in which the center is gone but the network remains. And networks are extraordinarily hard to kill. They do not depend on any single node. They survive the removal of their most visible elements because they are made of connections, not of concentrated power. Rome's network of roads, laws, languages, and institutions was one of the most extensive and deeply embedded networks the ancient world had ever produced. Removing the political center did not dissolve the network. It freed it to function on its own terms. At this point, a careful listener might raise a reasonable objection. Physics describes the behavior of matter and energy. It does not describe the behavior of empires, laws, languages, or civilizations. The comparison between entropy and the fall of Rome is suggestive, even beautiful, but it is still a metaphor, and metaphors can mislead as easily as they illuminate. That objection is fair, and it deserves a direct answer. The argument here is not that Rome's fall was governed by the laws of thermodynamics in a literal, calculable sense. The argument is something more modest and more interesting. It is that the patterns described by those laws, conservation, dispersal, redistribution, transformation without total loss, appear to describe what actually happened to Roman civilization with a surprising degree of accuracy. Not because physics controls history, but because the same universe that produces physical laws also produces human behavior. And human behavior, at large scales and over long periods of time, seems to follow patterns that rhyme with physical ones. The road did not vanish. The law did not vanish. The language did not vanish. The city did not vanish. These are not metaphors. These are observable, documented, measurable facts about what happened to Roman material and cultural production after the political centre of the Western Empire collapsed. The material dispersed, but it remained. The systems reorganized, but they persisted. The culture redistributed itself into new forms, but it continued to exert influence on the people and institutions that inherited its structures. That is not a metaphor for conservation. That is conservation playing out across a different kind of medium than a physics textbook usually addresses. And that recognition changes what it means to say, Rome collapsed. It means the political arrangement collapsed. The imperial branding collapsed. The centralized command structure collapsed. But the physical and cultural substrate, the actual material from which Roman civilization was constructed, did not collapse. It redistributed. It persisted. It continued to do the work it had always done, only now without a single name attached to it. Which means that everything built on top of that substrate, everything that followed in Europe over the next 15 centuries, was built not on the ruins of Rome, but on the continuing foundation of it. And that is a very different kind of story from the one usually told. Imagine standing in the middle of a road that was built 2,000 years ago. Not a replica, not a reconstruction. The actual road, or what remains of it beneath the asphalt that was laid on top of it in the 20th century. The stone is still there, under everything. The straightness is still there. The route is still there. Travellers still move along it today, following a line that was drawn by Roman engineers who have been dead for 18 centuries. That is not archaeology. That is continuity. The Roman road network was one of the most extraordinary achievements of the ancient world. At its height, Rome had built approximately 80,000 kilometres of hard-surfaced roads across its territory, from Britain in the northwest to the edges of Mesopotamia in the east. These were not dirt paths worn by repeated use. They were engineered structures, built in layers, designed to drain water, resist frost, and bear the weight of armies, wagons, and commerce without significant deterioration. They were built to last, and they did. Long after the Western Empire lost its political coherence, the roads remained. They continued to serve travellers, merchants, pilgrims, and armies. Medieval Europe used Roman roads as its primary transportation network for centuries after Rome's political centre had vanished. In Britain, the road network built by Roman engineers remained the skeleton of British transport all the way through the Middle Ages, and in some cases into the early modern period. Entire economies organised themselves around these routes. Towns grew up at Roman road junctions. Markets formed at crossing points established by Roman planners, who had been dead for 1,000 years before the first medieval market stall was set up. The road did not need the empire to function. It only needed the ground beneath it to remain solid, and the people living around it to keep walking in the same direction. And that is the first ghost of Rome. Not a haunting in any mystical sense. A haunting in the most physical, material, tangible sense possible. A structure built by one civilization continuing to organize the movement and commerce of entirely different civilizations that had replaced it, without those later civilizations always understanding, or even asking why the road was there. The empire left its lines in the landscape, and the landscape remembered them long after the empire forgot its own name. If roads are the most visible ghost of Rome, law is the most invisible one, and invisible things are often the most durable. Roman law, in its developed form, was one of the most sophisticated legal systems the ancient world produced. It distinguished between public and private rights. It developed complex principles of contract, property, inheritance, and obligation. It created legal categories that allowed a society to function with predictable rules across enormous distances and diverse populations. And it was written down, codified, preserved, and transmitted across generations with extraordinary care. When the Western Empire's political structure weakened, the law did not weaken with it. If anything, it became more important. In the absence of central imperial authority, local leaders and communities needed reliable frameworks for resolving disputes, organizing property, and governing behavior. Roman law provided that framework. It was already known, it was already written, it was already respected. It continued to be applied in courts across the former imperial territory, sometimes explicitly, sometimes folded into new legal codes that borrowed heavily from Roman principles without always acknowledging the debt. The most remarkable example of this survival is the influence of Roman law on the legal systems of continental Europe. The legal traditions of France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Germany, and most of Latin America are built on a foundation of Roman legal principles. The concepts of legal personhood, of contractual obligation, of the distinction between civil and criminal matters, of property rights and inheritance rules, all of these flow directly from Roman jurisprudence. These are not historical curiosities. They are the active, living principles that govern courts and contracts today. That means Roman law did not end with the empire. It outlived the empire by surviving into the institutions that replaced it. It travelled through time by embedding itself in the legal education of medieval scholars, in the church courts that applied it across Europe, in the revival of Roman legal studies in the medieval universities of Bologna and Paris. It was studied, debated, adapted, and applied continuously from the fall of the Western Empire to the present day. A law that governs a court in Rome today may carry principles first articulated by a Roman jurist 17 centuries ago. The empire that produced that jurist is gone. The principle is not. That is not the survival of a relic. That is the survival of a system. And systems survive by being useful. Roman law survived because it was useful, because it worked, because it provided a reliable set of tools for organizing human behavior in complex societies. And no later civilization that encountered it could afford to simply throw it away. There is a word used in courtrooms across the world today, a Latin word, unchanged from the form it took in ancient Rome. When a lawyer speaks of habeas corpus, they are speaking Latin. When a doctor writes a prescription and abbreviates the instructions in a language their patient cannot read, they are using the descendants of Latin shorthand. When a scientist names a newly discovered species, they use a Latin or Latinized form, because that is still the universal convention of biological taxonomy. When a judge delivers a ruling and refers to precedent, the very concept of legal precedent is borrowed from Roman legal tradition, and the word for it has Latin roots. Latin did not die with Rome. It transformed into something more durable than a single language. It became a family of languages, a scientific vocabulary, a legal lexicon, a liturgical tradition, and an embedded layer of almost every major European tongue. French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian are direct descendants of Latin. English, though Germanic in its basic structure, absorbed enormous quantities of Latin vocabulary through French after the Norman conquest, and then again during the Renaissance, when scholars deliberately reached back into Latin to enrich the English language. More than half of the English words used in formal, legal, scientific, and academic writing have Latin roots. Every time someone uses the word legal, they are using a Latin word. Every time someone says justice, senate, citizen, republic, or municipal, they are speaking Rome's language. Every time a doctor describes a condition in medical terminology, they are working within a vocabulary that Roman physicians and scholars built and preserved. The empire is gone. Its vocabulary is everywhere. This is not nostalgia. This is not historical decoration. This is evidence of a civilization that persisted through one of its most powerful technologies, language. Because language is not just a tool for communication, it is a carrier of thought. And the thoughts that Latin carried, the concepts of law, governance, civic identity, institutional authority, and rational administration, did not dissolve when the empire's political structure ended. They persisted inside the language. and the language persisted inside everyone who kept speaking it, reading it, writing it, and teaching it to their children. Rome encoded itself into human speech, and human speech has not let it go. Here is a fact that most people, even educated ones, tend to gloss over when they tell the story of Rome's fall. The Eastern Roman Empire did not fall in 476 AD. It did not fall for nearly another 1,000 years. It continued to exist, to govern, to fight, to trade, to build, and to call itself Roman until 1453, when the Ottoman forces of Sultan Mehmed II took Constantinople and ended what had been the longest continuous Roman government in history. Let that settle for a moment. While Western Europe was reorganizing itself into new kingdoms and principalities after the 5th century, while the Franks and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Lombards were carving out territories from the former imperial map, there was still a Roman emperor sitting in a Roman capital, issuing Roman laws, commanding a Roman army, and presiding over a Roman court. He used Roman titles. His legal system was the codified Roman law of Justinian. His church conducted its services in a tradition that had grown directly from the Roman world. His scholars studied and preserved the classical tradition. His architects built in a style that had evolved continuously from Roman predecessors. That empire did not call itself Byzantine. That name was invented by later historians. The people who lived inside it called it what it was, the Roman Empire. And they were not wrong. They were the direct legal, institutional, and cultural successors of the empire that Julius Caesar and Augustus had built. The line of continuity from the Rome of Augustus to the Constantinople of Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor, who died defending his city in 1453, is unbroken. Which means that when someone says Rome fell in 476 AD, they are only describing what happened to half of it. The Eastern Roman Empire is a fascinating study in how identity persists through transformation. By the time Constantinople fell in 1453, the empire that called itself Roman was Greek in language, Orthodox Christian in religion, and Byzantine in culture in almost every outward sense. Latin had long since been replaced by Greek as the official language of administration and law. The Western territories were gone. The connection to the city of Rome itself was tenuous at best. And yet the emperors of Constantinople continued to style themselves as Roman emperors, continued to claim the legal succession of Augustus, and continued to be recognized by their subjects and neighbors as the legitimate continuation of the Roman state. This is paradoxical only if identity is understood as something fixed and unchanging. If identity is understood as something dynamic, something that adapts to survive, then the Eastern Roman Empire is a perfect example of a civilization doing exactly what civilizations must do to endure. It changed everything it needed to change. Language, theology, culture, geography, administration, all of these shifted and evolved over the centuries. But the core claim, the claim of Roman continuity, the claim of institutional legitimacy, remained constant. Because that claim was not just a political convenience, it was the load-bearing pillar of the entire edifice. The Eastern Empire derived its authority from being Rome. Remove that claim, and the entire structure of imperial legitimacy collapses. So the claim was maintained, adapted, refined, and defended, even as everything around it changed. The empire was Roman because it had to be. Because being Roman was the source of its authority. And because authority, once established on a particular foundation, tends to reinforce that foundation even when the foundation has changed shape. The lesson here is subtle but important. Civilizations survive not by remaining identical, but by maintaining the thread of claimed continuity while adapting everything else. Rome survived in the East not because the East stayed the same as the old Rome, but because the East successfully argued that it was still Rome even while becoming something different. Consider for a moment what actually happened in 476 AD. A man named Flavius Odoacer, a military commander of Germanic origin who had risen through the ranks of the Roman army, deposed a teenage emperor named Romulus Augustulus and sent him into comfortable exile in a Campanian villa. Odoacer then sent a message to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, informing him that the West no longer needed a separate emperor and that Odoacer would rule Italy on behalf of the unified empire. Notice what is missing from that account. No burning of Rome, no declaration of a new civilization, no announcement that the Roman Empire was over. Odoacer did not say, "The empire is finished. Something new is beginning." He said, "I am governing Italy in your name." He operated within the Roman system. He used Roman administrative titles. He preserved Roman laws. He governed Roman cities. He commanded Roman troops. What changed was the occupant of one particular throne in one particular city. What continued was almost everything else. The label Fall of Rome was not applied in 476 AD. It was applied retrospectively, by scholars looking back from a distance of centuries, trying to identify a clean marker for the transition from ancient to medieval. That marker is useful for historians. It helps organize the past into manageable segments. But it also imposes a finality on events that did not feel final to the people living through them. A farmer in Gaul in 476 AD did not experience the end of Rome. He experienced a change in who was collecting his taxes and who was commanding the garrison in the nearest town. The road outside his village still went where it had always gone. The law that governed his property disputes was still the same law. The Latin words he used to describe his world were still the same words. His experience of that year was not of collapse. It was of administrative reorganization, which is a very different thing, even if it looks the same from 1,000 years away. The human mind is drawn to endings. There is something deeply satisfying about a moment that resolves a long tension, that provides a clear before and after, that allows the past to be filed away as complete and the future to begin fresh. Endings are psychologically comfortable. They give the world edges. They make the complexity of continuous change feel manageable. History, pressed by this psychological need, tends to produce its narratives in the form of events, things that happened at identifiable moments: battles, treaties, deaths, crownings, burnings, and surrenders. These are the punctuation marks of historical narrative. They tell the reader where one sentence ends and another begins. But between those punctuation marks, life continued. Ordinary life, the life of roads and markets and marriages and harvests and legal disputes and building repairs and language change, does not operate according to the same calendar as political events. It moves at its own pace, which is usually slower, less dramatic, and far more resistant to the clean logic of endings. When Rome's Western political structure ended in the 5th century, it was a punctuation mark in the story of a particular kind of power. But it was not a punctuation mark in the story of the roads, or the laws, or the language, or the cities, or the trade routes, or the institutional habits. Those stories continued past the punctuation mark without pausing. They barely noticed it. They kept moving at their own pace, which was the pace of civilizational infrastructure, rather than the pace of political drama. That is why the fall of Rome is such a strange event to study. It was enormously significant in political terms, and almost invisible in structural terms. The political surface of the world changed dramatically. The deeper architecture of the world barely moved. There is a reason the fall of Rome is one of the most studied, most discussed, most dramatized events in all of Western history. And it is not simply because it was important, though it was. It is because it satisfies something deep in the way people understand the relationship between greatness and failure. Rome was the greatest political achievement of the ancient Western world. Its size, duration, administrative complexity, military power, cultural output, and lasting influence have no parallel in the centuries before it, and its fall is understood as the ultimate cautionary tale. Even the greatest things end. Even the most powerful systems collapse. Even the most durable empires have a final day. That narrative is irresistible because it is both terrifying and reassuring. Terrifying because it suggests that nothing is permanent. Reassuring because it suggests that endings are natural, that the collapse of great things is part of the order of the world, rather than a failure of human will or wisdom. It lets later generations feel that Rome's fall was inevitable, which means it was nobody's fault in particular, which means the lessons it teaches are about the nature of things rather than the failures of specific people. But that narrative depends on Rome actually having fallen, completely, finally, without remainder. And if Rome did not fall completely, if it transformed instead of vanishing, then the narrative changes. The cautionary tale becomes a different kind of story. Not a story about the inevitable death of great things, but a story about the extraordinary persistence of complex systems. Not a story about how even the greatest empires must end, but a story about how the greatest empires may never fully end at all, because they have distributed themselves too deeply into the structure of the world to be removed in any clean, total way. That is a less comfortable story. It does not provide the same clean closure, but it may be the more accurate one. A fragment is not a ruin. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem. A ruin is what remains when something has been destroyed. A fragment is what remains when something has been distributed. The difference is not just semantic. It is structural. A ruin speaks of ending. A fragment speaks of continuation in a different form. The pieces of Rome that survived the 5th century were not ruins in any meaningful sense. They were functioning fragments of a larger system, still doing the work they had always done, still organizing movement and behavior and thought, still providing the basic architecture of daily life for millions of people across a vast geographic space. The road was not a ruin of Roman transportation. It was Roman transportation still operating, just without the central authority that had originally commanded its construction. The same is true of the law, the language, the cities, the administrative habits, the institutional knowledge, and the cultural practices that continued after the Western Empire's political centre collapsed. These were not ruins of a dead civilization. They were operational fragments of a living one, redistributed across a new political landscape, embedded in new institutions, carrying old patterns under new names. And fragments, unlike ruins, can grow. They can attach themselves to new structures. They can embed themselves in new institutions. They can become the foundation for things that look entirely new while resting on inherited principles. Which is exactly what happened in the centuries after Rome's political decline. The fragments of Roman civilization did not sit inert in the rubble of the old empire. They grew into the medieval world, the Renaissance, the modern legal and political systems of Europe and its cultural descendants across the globe. The empire in fragments was not a dead empire. It was an empire in the process of becoming something harder to name. There is a kind of memory that does not live in minds. It lives in structures, in the layout of a city, in the text of a legal code, in the architecture of a court or a church or a university, in the habits of an administrative system that has been functioning long enough that the people inside it no longer remember when it began. This is institutional memory, and it is one of the most powerful forms of continuity that human civilization produces. Institutions carry the past forward, not by remembering it, but by enacting it. Every time a court applies a principle of Roman law, it is not commemorating Rome. It is continuing Rome, without necessarily knowing it. Every time a Catholic diocese organizes its territory along boundaries that were originally Roman administrative divisions, it is not preserving Roman history. It is living inside Roman history, shaped by it, organized by it, governed by its ancient logic. That is what makes institutional continuity so durable and so invisible. It does not present itself as historical. It presents itself as normal, as the way things are done, as the obvious and natural organization of the world. And once something has achieved the status of normal, it becomes almost impossible to uproot, because to uproot it would be to attack what feels like common sense, rather than what feels like inherited tradition. Rome survived most completely where it became most invisible, where its patterns became so normal that nobody thought to ask where they came from. And that kind of survival is the deepest kind there is, because it requires no defenders. It simply persists by being taken for granted. The relationship between Rome and Christianity is one of the most complex and consequential in all of Western history. Rome persecuted the early church. Rome also eventually adopted Christianity as its official religion. And then, as the political structures of the Western Empire weakened, the Christian church stepped into the administrative vacuum in ways that preserved enormous quantities of Roman organizational logic under a new banner. The church inherited Roman infrastructure in the most literal sense. Many of the earliest Christian basilicas were converted Roman public buildings. The word basilica itself was a Roman architectural and administrative term before it became a Christian one. The church adopted Roman administrative divisions and used them to organize its own hierarchy. Dioceses, a word derived directly from the Roman administrative unit of diocese, became the basic unit of church governance across Europe. Bishops governed territories that often corresponded closely to former Roman administrative regions. The Church also preserved Roman language. Latin remained the language of the Western Church long after it had ceased to be the spoken vernacular of most European populations. This meant that Roman linguistic patterns, Roman rhetorical traditions, Roman concepts of law and authority continued to be transmitted through church education, church correspondence, and church liturgy for centuries after the fall of the Western Empire. Medieval scholars, who could not speak a word of the daily vernacular of ancient Rome, could read and write classical Latin because the Church had kept it alive. In this way, the Church became one of the most powerful vehicles of Roman continuity, not by design, not as a project of deliberate preservation, but because the Church found Roman structures useful, Roman language authoritative, and Roman organizational logic effective. It used what worked, and what worked was Rome. Cities have long memories. They cannot help it. Every building sits on the footprint of the thing that stood there before. Every street follows the logic of the path that preceded it. Every neighborhood reflects decisions made by people who are no longer alive. The physical form of a city is a record of all the choices that shaped it, layered on top of one another, each generation building on, around, and through the remains of the previous one. In Europe, that layering almost always reaches down to Rome. London's financial district sits inside the boundaries of Roman Londinium. Paris grew from the Roman settlement of Lutetia, Vienna from Vindobona, Cologne from Colonia Agrippina, Budapest from Aquincum. The list runs through every major city in Western and Central Europe. These cities did not start fresh when the Roman Empire's political structure ended. They continued from where Rome had left them, using Roman streets, Roman water systems, Roman building foundations, and Roman spatial logic as the basis for everything that came after. The city remembered Rome because the city was built out of Rome, not metaphorically, literally. The stones, the streets, the water channels, the spatial organization. All of it was Roman material, Roman design, Roman engineering, still doing its work in the centuries after the empire had been relabeled as fallen. And the people who lived in those cities absorbed Roman spatial logic without knowing it. The city taught them how to organize space, how to move through it, how to relate to its centers and edges, through the simple experience of daily life, in a place that had been shaped by Roman hands. That is transmission without teachers. That is continuity without memory. That is the deepest kind of survival. Strip away the emperors. Strip away the legions, the senate, the name, the borders, the official language. Strip away everything that made Rome recognizable as a political entity. What is left is something more fundamental and more interesting. What is left is a pattern of centralized authority radiating outward through a network of roads. A pattern of uniform law applied across diverse populations. A pattern of administrative hierarchy, from the highest command to the smallest local official. A pattern of urban organization, with cities as the nodes of power, commerce, and culture. A pattern of language as a tool of governance, providing a common medium for administration across enormous distances. A pattern of engineering applied to infrastructure, creating physical structures designed to outlast the political will that commissioned them. These patterns did not belong exclusively to Rome, but Rome expressed them with a combination of scale, duration, and ambition that made them nearly impossible to forget once they had been observed. And they were observed. By the kingdoms that replaced Rome in the West, by the church that organized itself along Roman lines, by the scholars who studied Roman texts, by the architects who built in Roman styles, by the lawyers who applied Roman principles, by the medieval rulers who imagined themselves as new Caesars. Rome became a template, and templates are extraordinarily persistent. Once a pattern has been established at sufficient scale and with sufficient success, it tends to be replicated by anyone who needs to do the same things Rome did: govern large territories, move goods efficiently, administer diverse populations, project authority across distances, and build structures that last. The Roman pattern was available. It was proven. It was embedded in the landscape, the law, and the language. So it was used again and again, in forms that looked new but rested on foundations that were very old. One of the most revealing things about Rome is not what it was, but how often later civilizations tried to become it. Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800 AD, more than 3 centuries after the Western Empire's political collapse. The ceremony was deliberate, The title was deliberate. The claim to Roman succession was deliberate. Charlemagne did not simply want to be a powerful king. He wanted to be Rome. He organized his administration along Roman lines, promoted Latin literacy among his clergy and administrators, and built his capital at Aachen with an eye toward Roman architectural grandeur. He understood, as most successful rulers of the medieval period did, that Roman legitimacy was the most powerful kind of legitimacy available. He was not alone. The Holy Roman Empire, which succeeded Charlemagne's realm and persisted in various forms until 1806, was built entirely on the claim of Roman succession. Its very name declared that it was the continuation of Rome. For 1,000 years, the most powerful political entity in Central Europe defined itself not as something new, but as the heir of something ancient. The Byzantine Empire made the same claim from the east. The Russian Tsars, after Constantinople fell, made the claim that Moscow was the third Rome. The Catholic Church, organizing itself as a universal institution with Rome as its center, echoed the same logic. Napoleon, crowning himself emperor in 1804 in deliberate reference to Roman precedent, was doing what European rulers had been doing for 14 centuries, reaching back to Rome for the authority that nothing else could provide. That pattern of imitation and reference is itself a form of Roman survival. Every time a later ruler claimed Roman descent or Roman precedent, they were acknowledging that Rome had not truly ended. They were confirming that Roman authority remained the most legitimate kind available. And in doing so, they kept Rome alive, not as a physical empire, but as the ultimate source of political legitimacy in the Western world. The deepest kind of survival is the one that happens inside human thought. Rome survived in roads and laws and languages because those things are physical and institutional, tangible in the world. But Rome also survived in the way people thought about power, authority, order, and civilization. In the categories they used to understand the world. In the assumptions they did not know they were making. When medieval European thinkers imagined a just and orderly society, they imagined something that looked, structurally, very much like Rome. When they thought about law, they thought in Roman legal categories. When they thought about governance, they thought in terms inherited from Roman political philosophy. When they thought about the relationship between universal authority and local governance, they were thinking through a problem that Rome had created and partially solved. The vocabulary of their political imagination was Roman, even when they were not thinking about Rome at all. That is the most complete kind of survival. Not survival as memory, which can fade. Not survival as material, which can decay. Survival as the structure of thought itself, as the invisible architecture of how the world is understood. Rome survived most completely where it became so fundamental to human reasoning that people stopped noticing it was there at all. In that sense, Rome did not disappear into the past. It disappeared into the present, into the assumptions, categories, and conceptual frameworks that later civilizations used to organize their understanding of the world. And once something has embedded itself that deeply into human thought, the question of whether it has ended becomes almost impossible to answer, because it is no longer a thing in the world. It is a lens through which the world is seen. There is a way of looking at history that is not linear. Not as a sequence of events marching forward from past to future, each event leaving the previous one behind, but as a series of echoes, where old forms keep reappearing in new contexts, old patterns keep reasserting themselves in new guises, old questions keep demanding new answers from new generations who did not know they were inheriting old problems. Rome keeps echoing through history in exactly this way, not returning literally, not repeating in any mystical sense, but resurfacing structurally the same patterns of organization, authority, infrastructure, and culture, appearing again and again in the centuries after the empire's political center collapsed. Medieval Europe organized itself around patterns that rhymed with Rome. The Renaissance looked back to Rome as its model of civilizational achievement. The early modern nation-states built their administrative and legal structures on Roman foundations. The Enlightenment drew on Roman political philosophy. Even the American Republic, founded in the 18th century by men who thought deeply about Roman history, was designed with Roman forms in mind. A senate, a system of law, a conception of citizenship, an architecture of public buildings. None of these echoes were accidents. They were the result of a civilization that had embedded itself so deeply into the structure of Western thought and society that later generations kept returning to it, consciously or not, as the source of the patterns they needed. Rome echoes through history because history keeps finding that the Roman answers to certain questions are still the most useful ones available. And that is not the behavior of a dead civilization. It is the behavior of a living influence. Return for a moment to the physical world, to the laws that govern the behavior of matter and energy, to the principle that nothing truly disappears, that everything changes form, but nothing is lost from the total inventory of the universe. That principle has held through every test that science has applied to it. It has not failed in any domain where it has been examined. It holds for atoms, for heat, for light, for momentum, for every form of energy that physicists have been able to measure and track. Now consider what it would mean if human civilizations behaved according to the same basic logic. Not because history is physics. Not because societies are governed by the same equations as thermodynamic systems. But because the universe that produces physical laws also produces human behavior, and the patterns that emerge at sufficient scale and over sufficient time may rhyme with physical ones in ways that are more than coincidental. If that is true, even partly, then the idea that Rome disappeared completely becomes not just historically questionable but physically counterintuitive. The material of Rome did not vanish. The roads are still there, under the asphalt. The legal principles are still there, inside the codes. Language is still there, inside the vocabulary. The institutional patterns are still there, inside the organizations. The architectural forms are still there, inside the buildings. The conceptual frameworks are still there, inside the thought. Where exactly did Rome go? It went into form, into structure, into the invisible architecture of the world that replaced it. It was conserved, not in any mystical sense, but in the most ordinary, physical, observable sense. The matter and meaning that made up Roman civilization were redistributed into what came next. And what came next was built from them, shaped by them, organized according to them, whether the builders knew it or not. That is not the fall of an empire. That is the transformation of one. Here is the strange thing about endings. They depend on who is doing the watching. From inside the Western Empire in the 5th century, the experience was not of ending but of change. Gradual, sometimes violent, often disorienting change. But change, not erasure. The roads were still there. The courts were still functioning. Latin was still spoken. Cities were still inhabited. The change was political, administrative, and in some regions social. But it was not total. It was not experienced as the end of everything. The experience of total ending was created later, by historians looking back from a distance, trying to organize the past into a coherent narrative. They drew a line at 476 AD and called it the Fall. That line is real, in the sense that it marks a genuine political discontinuity. But it is also constructed, in the sense that it imposes a completeness on events that were experienced as far more ambiguous by the people who lived through them. And constructed endings have a way of shaping how everything on either side of the line is understood. Once the fall of Rome is established as a definitive event, the period before it becomes the ancient world, and the period after it becomes the medieval world, and the two are treated as separate, almost as if they occurred in different universes rather than in continuous time, in the same landscape, among the same families, along the same roads, under the same stars. But the road does not know which side of the line it is on. The language does not recognize the boundary. The law does not stop at the year 476. The city does not empty because a historian has decided that history has ended. Only the label changes. The life continues. The power to name an ending is not a neutral act. It is one of the most consequential things a historian can do. Because naming an ending does not just describe the past. It shapes how the past is understood by everyone who comes after. It draws a line that separates what was from what is, what mattered from what came next, what counts as part of the story and what counts as its aftermath. When later historians named 476 AD as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, they were making a choice, a reasonable choice based on a real political event, but also a choice that carried enormous implications for how everything before and after that date would be interpreted. It made the centuries of Roman civilization that preceded it feel like a story with a definitive ending. And it made the centuries of European history that followed it feel like a new beginning, separate from and independent of what came before. But the people living in those centuries did not experience that separation. They experienced continuity. They lived in Roman cities, travelled on Roman roads, spoke languages descended from Latin, governed themselves according to legal principles inherited from Rome, worshipped in churches organised along Roman administrative lines, and imagined their political world in categories that Rome had created. They were not living in the aftermath of Rome. They were living inside its dispersed, transformed, but still functioning inheritance. The name ending created a before and after that the world itself had not created, and that name has shaped our understanding of European history ever since. It has made Rome feel more finished than it was, and it has made the medieval and modern worlds feel more original than they are. Memory, at the civilizational scale, does not work the way personal memory works. Personal memory is fragile, selective, subject to emotion and revision. Civilizational memory is structural. It lives in the things a civilization builds and the practices it maintains. It is transmitted not through recollection but through use. Every time a medieval court applied a Roman legal principle, it was transmitting Roman memory through practice. Every time a church organized its diocese along the boundaries of a former Roman administrative region, it was transmitting Roman memory through structure. Every time a scholar copied a Roman text and passed it on to the next generation of students, it was transmitting Roman memory through text. And every time a language carried a Latin word into a new century, it was transmitting Roman memory through speech. This kind of memory does not require anyone to remember Rome. It only requires that people keep doing the things Rome built the infrastructure to support. Using the roads, applying the laws, speaking the language, living in the cities, practicing the administrative habits. As long as those activities continued, Roman memory continued with them, silently, invisibly, without ceremony or intention, simply through the persistence of use. That is why civilizational memory is so durable. It does not depend on individuals who might forget. It depends on systems that keep functioning. And systems, as we have seen, are extraordinarily persistent. They outlast their founders. They outlast the political arrangements that created them. They outlast the names attached to them. They persist as long as they are useful. And the Roman system, in its many dispersed and transformed forms, remained useful to the people who inherited it for centuries, even millennia, after the political centre that created it had gone silent. By now, a pattern has emerged. It runs through roads and laws and languages and cities and institutions and thought. It connects the most material and physical aspects of Roman civilization to the most abstract and conceptual ones. And it points toward a single, unsettling question that this entire story has been building toward. If all of these things continued, if the roads persisted, the law survived, the language endured, the cities kept functioning, the institutions kept operating, the patterns kept reappearing, the assumptions kept shaping thought, then what exactly collapsed? The political arrangements collapsed. A particular form of centralized Western authority ended. A specific set of imperial titles and administrative structures ceased to function in the way they had been designed to function. Those things are real, and their ending was significant. But they were not all of Rome. They were the visible surface of a much larger and more complex system. And the surface is not the same as the system. The system did not collapse. The system transformed. It redistributed its components across a new political landscape. It embedded its patterns in new institutions. It encoded its principles in new languages. It organized new cities along old lines. It shaped new thought with old categories. And it did all of this so thoroughly and so invisibly that later generations could look at the medieval and modern worlds it had shaped and believe they were looking at something entirely new. But they were not looking at something new. They were looking at Rome, wearing different clothes, speaking different languages, organized under different names. But still Rome, in every structural sense that matters. And that realization, when it arrives, does not feel like a historical discovery. It feels like waking up inside a room that was always there, and only now seeing what it is made of. Everything that's been laid out across the preceding chapters points toward the same place. The roads that survived, the laws that persisted, the language that continued, the Eastern Empire that kept breathing, the institutions that carried Roman patterns under new names, the cities that kept functioning on Roman foundations, the intellectual frameworks that kept thinking in Roman categories, the rulers who kept claiming Roman legitimacy, the scholars who kept studying Roman texts, the lawyers who kept applying Roman principles, the architects who kept building in Roman styles, the churches that kept organizing themselves along Roman lines. None of these things are coincidences. None of them are decorative survivals, curiosities left over from a dead civilization. They are evidence of a system that did not disappear, a civilization that transformed rather than collapsed, an empire that survived its political ending by distributing itself so thoroughly into the structure of the world that replacing it became impossible, because replacing it would have meant replacing the roads, the laws, the language, the cities, the thought, and the institutional habits of an entire civilization all at once. No one could do that, and so no one did. And Rome persisted, not as a throne or a name or a political claim, but as the invisible architecture of everything that came after it. That is the final synthesis. Not that Rome was eternal in any mystical sense, not that it was immune to change, but that it was embedded deeply enough in the physical and institutional fabric of Western civilization, that its disappearance was always going to be more apparent than real, always going to be a relabeling rather than an erasure, always going to be a change of surface rather than a change of foundation. Stand in any major European city and look at the map. The streets that seem to follow no obvious logic, the ones that cut at odd angles through otherwise orderly neighborhoods, the ones that have been there so long nobody questions why they go where they go. Those streets are often Roman, not in name, not in appearance, but in origin. They follow routes established by Roman surveyors who walked the same ground almost 2,000 years ago and decided, for reasons of military efficiency or drainage or trade, that this was the correct line for movement through this particular landscape. The city grew around that decision. Centuries of buildings rose along those edges. Markets formed at those junctions. Neighborhoods took shape around those routes. And the people who live along those streets today have no idea that the path outside their window was originally decided by a man who wore a toga and reported to an emperor. They simply know that this is where the street is. This is how the city works. This is the shape of the world. That is what it means to live inside an echo. Not to hear it clearly, not to recognize it as an echo at all, but to inhabit the space it created, to move through the patterns it established, to organize life according to the logic it left behind, without any conscious awareness that the original sound was ever made. The echo of Rome is everywhere in the modern Western world, and almost nowhere in modern Western consciousness. People speak languages that Latin shaped, without hearing Latin in them. They live under legal systems that Roman jurists designed, without recognizing the Roman hand in their governance. They move through cities laid out according to Roman spatial logic, without imagining togas at the original planning meeting. They use political concepts, civic, republic, senate, citizen, justice, without connecting them to the civilization that coined and defined them. This is the deepest and most complete kind of survival. Not survival as monument, which requires maintenance and eventually crumbles. Not survival as memory, which requires carriers and eventually fades. But survival as assumption, as the invisible ground beneath thought. As the thing so fundamental to the structure of the world that questioning it would feel like questioning the shape of air. Rome survived by becoming the unexamined foundation, and unexamined foundations do not get replaced. They simply get built upon, again and again, by each generation that does not realize it is standing on inherited ground. Here, at the end of this long journey through roads and laws and languages and empires and physics and thought, there is a final thing to be said. It is not a dramatic claim. It is not a conspiracy. It is not a suggestion that everything taught in schools is wrong. It is something quieter and stranger than any of those things. It is this. The Roman Empire did not collapse in the way the standard story says it did. Its political center weakened and eventually ceased to function in the West. That part of the story is true. But the empire itself, understood as a system of roads, laws, languages, cities, institutions, and intellectual frameworks, did not end. It redistributed, it transformed. It embedded itself so deeply into the structure of what came after, that the world built on its foundations forgot what those foundations were made of. And physics, of all things, offers the clearest language for what happened. Conservation, transformation, persistence through change. The universe does not erase things, it changes their form. And Rome, that vast, complex, interconnected system of human organization, followed the same logic. It changed form, again and again, until it became the world. Not the world of 2,000 years ago, not the world of ancient maps and marble columns, the world of today, the legal codes that govern modern nations, the languages that carry modern thought, the urban forms that organize modern life, the institutional habits that shape modern governance, the intellectual categories that structure modern understanding, all of it resting, quietly and invisibly, on foundations that a civilization called Rome spent centuries putting in place. That is the chronological echo at the heart of this story. Not a sound that stopped when the empire fell, but a sound that kept travelling through stone and law and speech and thought across every century that followed, still moving, still shaping, still present in the structure of a world that learned long ago to mistake its foundation for the ground. Rome did not end in fire, it did not end in defeat. It did not end in silence, or in ruin, or in the abdication of a teenage emperor in a Campanian villa. Rome ended in the only way a civilization that size could ever truly end, slowly, silently, by becoming so thoroughly the world that the world stopped noticing it was there. And if you listen carefully, past the noise of everything modern and new and urgent, you can still hear it, in the shape of the street outside, in the word you just used without thinking, in the law that protected something you cared about, in the city that organized your morning, in the thought you just had about how the world should be ordered. That is not history speaking. That is Rome, still here, still working, still the foundation beneath everything you call the present. And the most extraordinary thing is not that it survived. The most extraordinary thing is that it survived so completely that you never had to be told it was there.